Welcome back to Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So last time I tried to develop with you the right side of the plausibility argument I'm making and try to give an account of central features of human spirituality and to try not use that term therefore in a vague, indefinite way. And I made an argument for how relevance realization can explain many of the facets that are found within the normal attribution of human spirituality. And I proposed a term, religio, to cover all of those aspects of spirituality that can be explained by the machinery of relevance realization. There was, of course, an important lacuna. There was something that was still missing from that account. And this was the account of the sacred. And then I proposed to you, in order to avoid confusion, especially post-Schleiermacher, that we should make a distinction between the metaphysical proposal of the ground or the cause of the experience of sacredness, where Schleiermacher is emphasizing the experience, and then for reasons of the way my argument has unfolded, since I'm talking about the psychoexistential machinery of sacredness as opposed to the metaphysical proposal, at least initially, that is where I should begin. So I'm talking now, we began to speak about a way of using the theoretical machinery we have developed here in order to talk about sacredness. And we began by going to the work that we'd already talked about domicide, back to the work of Geertz. And we talked about sacredness. One of the ways it functions, one of the ways we can experience it, is that it functions as a meta-meaning system that affords worldview attunement and thereby homes us against horror. But then I noted that, of course, in the Hellenistic domicide, there was not only the machinery that attempted to rehome us, like the syncretic religions, and one could probably argue also Stoicism, as I've already argued, but there was an alternative response, which was the transgressive response of the Gnostics, ultimately. And I then said that gives us an opening into another aspect of sacredness, and this is the work of Otto and his book that, as I mentioned, was typically entitled The Idea of the Holy, and I said a better translation would perhaps be The Experience of the Numinous. And what Otto was proposing is that before we had a moral interpretation of holiness, there was a pre-moral view of what I'm calling sacredness, and this, or at least an aspect of sacredness, I should say. And what Otto was pointing to was the experience of the numinous, which is closely related to the adjective that is most applied to God, for example, in the Old Testament, which is glorious. God is shining and overwhelming and powerful, but glory does not carry with it any moral sense. In fact, one way of interpreting what's going on in the book of Job is a contrast between some of Job's moral arguments about his suffering and God's response is to present his glory and how numinous he is. And so you're seeing sort of a conflict between these different aspects of holiness in Job. Of course, that's not all that's happening in the book of Job, and perhaps when I speak of Jung, we'll get back to that. But right now what I want to pick up on is this insight by Otto that a part of sacredness seems to be the experience of the numinous. And the numinous seems to be transgressive in an important way. It seems to be, in fact, it seems to be taking us into the heart of the very thing that the Geertzian model of sacredness was supposed to home us against, which is experiences that border on horror. Now, Otto describes this experience of the numinous as having three central aspects to it. It is a mystery, very much in the way I argued last time, the sense that we got from Marcel of something that brings about sensibility transcendence, that sort of trajectory of transframing. And then it has two opposing poles in it which make a lot of sense, I think, given what we've built together here. One is that it is deeply fascinating. It compels. So a good way of, I think, a very plausible way of understanding is this is super salient to you. It is really grabbing your attention, involving you. You can't pull away. So it's super salient. And then the other is, he said, it's terrifying, it's horrifying. There's an aspect of horror to this. Now, I got to stop for a minute. I don't want to use the word terror. It goes back to his original term. But the problem with terror is, of course, it has become deeply enmeshed with us with notions of terrorism. And I want to put that aside. I'm going to use the word horror because it doesn't have that kind of association. But I have to now distance how I want to use this word from how it's become typically used by us. So I once mentioned to you that most mystery novels and mystery movies aren't mysterious at all. They don't have you confront mystery, they give you just a difficult problem to solve. And in that sense, they're instances of a kind of important modal confusion that is pervasive in our culture. The same thing with many horror movies. Many horror movies do not actually expose you to horror. Many horror movies actually expose you to being deeply startled with fear. Okay, so deeply startled with fear. So much of what passes for horror movies are movies that prey on our sort of ancestral fear of predation. So that where there's some monster although the monster points towards something, and I'll come back to that, and this is work, of course, made by good work done by Jonathan Pajot on how we should think about monsters. We'll come back to that. And the monster is basically hidden in some way or unknown, and it's preying upon people, and most of what's called horror is how the surprising way in which the monster will suddenly appear and prey upon its victims, and then they get ripped apart. So you were startled, oh no, ah, right, and most of that is not horror. I mean, I imagine it has. I find those movies boring, actually. I understand why some people. This is just a statement of taste. I don't find them very interesting. Those sort of startle and puncture movies don't appeal to me. And they're often enmeshed also with sort of crypto messages about sexuality and things like that need to be challenged. Putting all of that aside, right? So when I say horror, there's a few movies that capture it, because horror has to do with what we talked about with respect to Geertz. Horror is when your sense of contact with reality is being challenged, undermined, where you feel you have a grasp on things and then it's slipping away. So horror, therefore, is often prototypically not associated with fear or directly with fear. It's associated with insanity or madness. And of course, there is the primordial fear of becoming insane, right? Now, the monster points to something very, very interesting. And this goes back to the work of Mary Douglas, right? That we often find creatures that are intercategorical for us monstrous because that's on a continuum with another important feature of things being intercategorical. So what is meant by intercategorical? Intercategorical are things that don't fall into our ready-made categories, and therefore we typically regard them as weird. She talks about how they're unclean. She does an interesting discussion about in the Bible, the book of Leviticus, all the animals that are unclean, they're very weird. It's a very weird collection. If you tried to find some sort of essence, like why owls are unclean and crocodiles are unclean and whatever, and certain birds are unclean and it doesn't make any sense. And then she goes in and argues, well, no, what happens is there's various ways in which there's ways in which people have categorized things, and those categories, right, have a certain pattern. And when that pattern is being broken, then these things challenge our grip on the world. They challenge our grip on the world. So, for example, like there's the idea, Douglas argues, that you should have an interconnection between a creature's sort of shape, its morphology, its means of locomotion, and its location, like where it lives. So if it lives in the sea, it should swim, and therefore it should have a fish shape. So you have things that are in the sea that don't seem to be swimming, like the crawly shellfish, and therefore they're kind of weird, and they turn out to be unclean. And then you also have this same, she argues, this same schema is applied. Now we think, oh, those archaic, ancient people. No, but remember, don't do that, because we talked about how we also have purity codes. We find things unclean that thwart our system of categorization. So, remember, if I take this and spit into it repeatedly and then swirl it around and drink it back, you're grossed out. That's unclean to you, because I have this whole structural functional organization, a way of categorizing myself and my self's relationship to my body and how that's other than the environment, and then there's important boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. And when the spit comes out of me, it becomes intercategorical. It's me, but it's not me, because it's not inside me, but it's outside of me, but somehow it was produced, and it's intercategorical, it's yucky, and get rid of it, right? So this is not a feature of ancient thought. This is a way in which we respond to things that violate our core categorical ways of making sense of the world. Now, some of those things we just regard as yucky or gross or unclean. But if the intercategorical thing is intercategorical between really, really central categories, and it is represented as threatening to us, then it originally invoked horror for us. So if you take a look at many horror creatures, they're prototypically intercategorical, right? The wolfman is intercategorical between the bestial and the personal, right? The ghost is intercategorical between the living and the dead. The vampire is also intercategorical between the living and the dead, and also between, being alive in the sense of consuming and being alive in the sense of being able to be generative, because of course the vampires consume and do not produce. And so, and of course, there's the work that Christopher Mastropietro and Philip Miscevic and I did, and Jonathan Pajot ultimately, independently, not ultimately, maybe ultimately, but independently did work on the zombie, and how the zombie is an intercategorical monster to represent our current situation, the meaning crisis. And you're going to see a video of Chris Mastropietro and I talking about all of that, so I won't get that into detail. So the fact that the monster is intercategorical points, right, and that intercategoricalness can be on a spectrum from just ooh, yucky to losing a grip on reality and intelligibility, because of the deep connectedness between realness and intelligibility. This points, again, to the connection to madness, and all of this points to losing a grip, losing that contact, that comprehensive grip, losing that optimal grip on reality. So you can create pretty significant horror without having to do the startle and puncture moment. I want to relate one to you where I've had the most prototypical and salient example of an experience of horror that had nothing to do with sort of the prototypical being something jumping out of the shadow with sharp pointy bits. So I was watching Kubrick's The Shining. Many of you have probably seen it. If you haven't seen it, of course, there's been 10,000 memes about it. It's pervasive throughout popular media. And my own intellectual arrogance contributed to the aesthetics of the horror. I was watching this movie, and spoilers here, but this movie's been around for a long time, so I think it's fair game. I was watching this movie, and I'm watching this character, and he seems to be going mad, the Jack Nicholson character, and that in and of itself is very interesting, and of course evocative of all of this. And then I'm getting, oh, right, Stephen King, has some sort of deep criticisms of alcoholism, and so this is a very extended metaphor for the descent through alcoholism into madness. And then I was patting myself on my back. I get this movie. This movie's it's just a symbolic way of talking about alcoholism and everything. And he's hearing voices in his head. Oh, that's clear sense of madness. And I had it all well structured, well in hand, as we say. And then there's a scene where his wife actually traps Jack Nicholson inside some sort of pantry and locks it from the outside. And then I remember sort of coming to sort of a full stop, and I'm like, what's going to happen now? She's trapped him. He's locked in. That's it. And the voices are talking to him in his head, and I'm sort of dismissing that because, he's mad, he's going to talk to the voices. But so what? And the voices are sort of in his head are sort of chiding him, and, what do you do? How'd you let it get to this? And I'm going, you're mad, and you're going to spiral into insanity. Great, and everything. And then the voices say, okay, it's time to go. And then the voices say, now we're going to let you out. And then they open the door from the outside. The voices in his head. And a chill went down my spine because I realized, I'm in a much different world than I thought I was in. I thought I had this completely down. And no, these voices have an independent reality. And there's something else going on here. Now, nothing startling was happening. All they were doing was opening the door so he could get out. But it was an absolute chill of horror going through me because, and that's the most profound experience of horror I've ever had in a movie, precisely because what had happened there was I went from being out here looking at all of this to, I don't know what's going on, and I was suddenly participating in his madness because I didn't know what was going on, and I was losing a grip on the situation, and there were forces at work here that I didn't understand. That's horror. Okay, that's horror. And I think there's situations that bring people into genuine horror, but I think it's much rarer than we realize. All right. So given that, and like I said, we will return to talk about this later, given the sense of horror as being, the polar extreme of this continuum of the weirdness, the eeriness, the yuckiness of the intercategorical, the spaces in our grip on reality through which things can slip, right? We can return to this. So the numinous is super salient. There's almost something like a flow state in that we're being drawn into it. But it also has with it aspects of horror. It shakes at the structure of our worldview. Now you say, whoa, what's an example of this? Okay, so here's an example of, I think, where people brush up against the numinous. And it's fairly widespread, so many of you will have encountered it. It's one that I find, I guess, annoying because I find it dangerous. So this happens. You're driving home, and there's been an accident on the highway. And people are slowing down. It's very dangerous to slow down. Everybody knows you shouldn't slow down like that because it's dangerous to slow down. Because the chances are you're going to cause another accident, which does in fact frequently happen. But nevertheless, people feel compelled to slow down. They are fascinated by this because they hope to see something horrifying. Not just disgusting. They're hoping that they will see death. That they'll somehow get a confrontation with this. And that, of course, is horrifying because death has the capacity to, the confrontation with the threat of death, the presence of death, has the possibility to completely sever your grip on reality. Literally, in fact, right? But they can't look away. But if they see something, they have the potential of being very unpleasantly horrified. But of course, there's something also missing in this because they can't actually see death. Right? They can see the fact of death, in the sense of the result of something or someone dying, but that won't actually put them into something we've already discussed. That won't actually give them what they want, a grip on the mystery of death, the phenomenological mystery of death. And that tells you something, right? Wonder and awe have us open up to mystery, but if the mystery becomes overwhelming, if it causes us to lose any potential sense, any sense of our potential ability to get, right, an insight or an understanding that typically comes with wonder, right? Awe is sort of liminal. But with horror, it's like, it's expanding so fast and I'm getting overwhelmed so fast, I'm being forced to accommodate so fast, this is like the absolute worst culture shock, and I'm experiencing horror. So, we can think of horror is when, notice what you've got here. You've got all the indications of flow, right? Or something like flow, at least the beginning of it, right? Where you're getting drawn in this accelerating loop. Something like it, at least. Right? It's super salient to you, but it's super salient, and this is why I'm hesitating to just call it straight out flow. It's super salient, but not in the fact that you're deeply coupled. It's super salient in the way that you're seeking to be deeply coupled, and the machinery is going faster and faster, but it's not actually getting a purchase. Because what's happening is you're getting horrified by a mystery. Now it's like, wow, that's an experience of the numinous? And if you read parts of the Bible, or you can read other literature too, but the Bible, of course, is prototypical for a lot of these people, these researchers like Otto. Like there's passages in the Old Testament in which God is like this, right? There's weird and strange and horrifying aspects of God. Fascinating, super salient, and you're drawn in, and it's like I say, I don't want to call it anti-flow because anti-flow is depression, but it's like the shadow of flow. You're trying to, and you're getting drawn in, and all the machinery of coupling is speeding up to try and get what it can't get, which is a stable relationship. And so, wonder, you don't get wonder, you might not even get awe. If it's too much, it can pass into horror. So, it's plausible that this is one of the ways of interpreting certain even commands in the Bible, like you're supposed to, it's often translated as you're supposed to fear God. This doesn't make any sense for a lot of reasons, because God is prototypically not the object that you can run away from or fight, or like what your fear would be absurd. It doesn't make any sense. But I think a better account of this is, right, you're supposed to have awe for God. And notice how this is the basis of this word, awesome, but it's also the basis of this word, awful. right? Because it borders on horror. So there's a sense of the experience of sacredness that is supposed to take us to the very horizon of our intelligibility, the very, very precipice of our ability to make sense and make meaning of the world. It's supposed to take us, I would say, right, it's supposed to draw us in, and the hope is not to just throw us into horror, but to take us towards horror until we experience, right, that sort of boundary between awe and horror, where we are forced into a situation of confrontation with a demand to change. A demand to change who and what we are. And in that sense, this will overlap with the higher states of consciousness, in that this carries with it a sense of being terrifically real, and I mean that, terrifically real, and that, right, it is putting a demand on us to accommodate, to expand our capacity to framing, for framing, that it is pushing us to our very, very, very limits. And the aspect of horror is the sense, stronger words needed here, the realization that we are indeed finally, ultimately limited, that no matter how much we grow, we can't grow enough to encompass the mysteries that we are confronting. So the point of the horror, I think, is to get us not only to grow, but to remember that our growth will always be the growth of a mortal, limited being, a being that is always caught up in relevance realization. So, notice how I've been pushing how much this is taking you to sort of the deepest powerful accommodation, the deepest opening up, right? Forcing tremendous change on you, varying who you are. And this is also an aspect of the sacred. Now think about how you can relate this on the continuum that we've been talking about. This is the ultimate frame breaking. But this isn't just breaking any frame. This is, this is trans-frame breaking. This is breaking your capacity for framing, or at least taking it to the very, as I said, the very limits where you are forced into a trajectory of transframing that is also acknowledging that you are ultimately insufficient. It's supposed to, in this, and I'm using this in a technical sense, it is supposed to humiliate you. The problem for us, humiliate, is that we can only hear this negatively. But of course, humility, a deep, deep appreciation of one's inescapable limitations, is part of, I've argued, the function of horror. It is to bring you to that state of accommodation, while maximal accommodation, while also deeply reminding you, sati, that you can never become, anything beyond a finite being. It's to prevent inflation. It is to prevent you ever assuming that you are more than you can ultimately be. So it's a deep kind of reminding that's put at the heart of this power. Look, if I could just sort of accommodate in wonder and awe, there's a temptation that I would inflate and think, I am, right? Now this puts you, the numinous, and therefore puts you into confrontation with something that is much greater than yourself. And also that has an existence, by definition, independent of you, precisely because of the way it can threaten you. So notice what we've got here. We've got over here, we've got, worldview, we've got the sacred doing these two things. Sacredness. Sorry, I keep slipping on that. It's just the way language drives you, eh? I fear we're not getting rid of God because we still believe in grammar. Okay, so sacredness. Over here, we have worldview attunement. And it's very clear why that would be regarded as sacred. This homes us against horror. But we've of this other notion of sacredness, which is the numinous, which is designed to do the opposite. It's designed to expose us, fascinate us. Horror with horror. So over here, we had, right, basically what I'm going to argue is meta-assimilation. We had that meta-meaning that is designed to get everything to fit together, to belong together. The agent and the arena fit together. But then you have the opponent process. The opponent process. And this is, as I've already argued, this is meta-accommodation. Sacredness is doing a very powerful, not at the level of your individual projects or problems. This is doing it at the level of your existential being in the world. It is doing higher order relevance realization. It is pushing the machinery of relevance realization again down through all of the levels of your knowing into your existential modes, into the depths, the primordial depths of the agent-arena relationship, and then it's blowing it apart, setting it in motion with opponent processing that's doing powerful, higher order relevance realization. Sacredness, I think, is a deep way in which we are seriously playing with, and now the seriousness is at the level of awe and horror, and also home, which is also deeply serious to you. We are seriously playing with the machinery of relevance realization and pushing it towards greater and greater development of optimizing it, improving it, enhancing it. So, if that's right, if sacredness is, right, the experience of this machinery as opposed to either one of its poles, that tells us, again, about its deep functionality. That what we're doing in sacredness is we're playing with the machinery of relevance realization in order to try and create states of mind, states of body, states of interaction with the world that optimize in a comprehensive and profound manner the machinery of relevance realization, our connectedness to the world, to ourselves, and to each other. This, I would, for example, explain why music is so deeply associated with sacredness. I mean, music isn't about anything, not in a conceptual referential sense. Nevertheless, as Nietzsche said, life would be a mistake without music, because in music we are playing just with the machinery of salience landscaping, just with all of this machinery in a powerful way, for no other reason than for its own sake. We try to get into a flow state in which we are just for its own sake, seriously playing with this machinery. And that's why music is such a pivotal way in which we try to convey and represent the sacred, and why music strikes us so perspectively in such a participatory way. We don't just think about music, or right, it insinuates its way into our perspectival salience landscape, and we embody it. The rhythms and what's happening in the music becomes sewn into our processes of co-identification. The way the world as an arena is disclosed to me, and the way my agency is being structured, are being deeply transformed by music. One of the great difficulties with our culture, of course, and I suppose we need to do work on this, how it contributes to the meaning crisis, is the degree to which we have trivialized music, and the degree to which we have severed it from, at least explicitly and consciously, from its connection to the sacred. I think why many people still are so deeply dependent on music, especially when they're going through any transformative period in their life, is precisely because of the way it puts them back in touch and helps them remember, at least intuitively, some of this machinery of seriously playing with the higher order relevance realization machinery of sacredness. Now, that opens up something that we need to talk about, because I'm now invoking how we can use something that's, and we're going to have to do work on this, something that's symbolic like music in order to play, in order to activate, accentuate, and play with this machinery in a powerfully transformative manner. And of course, religions which are which have these aspects to them also are rich with the symbolic machinery that is designed to activate and seriously play with this. So I want to talk about the relationship or the role that symbols have in our experience of sacredness. So the important thing is how we're going to use this word, and symbol originally means to put two things together, and I want to distinguish this. The talk that I did with Chris that you'll see, one of the talks also distinguishes between a symbol and a sign. So I won't go into great detail here. This is sort of central in semiotic, because we use this term in multiple ways, like we talk about abstract symbolic thought, but then we talk about the cross as an important religious symbol, and we can get very quickly confused. And so a sign refers, right? So it by looking at it, we can look through it to look at something else. So I can use this as a sign for love, because when you see this, it helps you to think of love. But this doesn't actually exemplify. Symbols refer, right? But more importantly, they exemplify in a particular way. They exemplify by getting you to participate in that to which they refer. They're going to invoke, of course, participatory knowing, because they have to do ultimately with getting down to the machinery of the agent-arena participatory relationship. So compare this as a sign for love, and this is something, as I said, that Chris and I did, to kissing someone, because kissing someone doesn't just make you think of love, it actually gets you to participate, it activates and gets the machinery. Kissing is, and I mean this carefully, is serious play with the machinery of the agent-arena relationship, so that we can participate in a reciprocal relationship with another human being, where we are, where there's reciprocal realization occurring between us. We can together remember the being mode, etc. So there's a difference there. I want to try and unpack this a little bit more. Symbols do this sort of double job, and they do this by having at their core a metaphor. Now we've got to slow down here because this is also something that needs to be understood a little bit more carefully. And we've talked about this before, about the word metaphor is itself a metaphor. It means to carry over or carry across. What I'm doing in a metaphor is I have two different domains, and I want to see this domain differently. So I basically look through, this is at least the theory of Black, I look through this thing to look at this. So I'm saying that Sam is a pig, here's Sam, here's a pig. I put on sort of pig glasses, sorry for that, and then I look at Sam differently, and there's the salience topography of Sam is altered, or Tony talks about this in salience imbalance, and that reconfiguration of what I find salient in Sam allows me to see Sam differently. I get an insight into Sam. And of course, I'm not actually claiming that Sam is a pig, and I'm not just comparing and saying Sam is like a pig. I'm doing this act of looking through and seeing this, and thereby getting an insight into it in an important way. That's fine. Okay. Now, we have to understand, first of all, how pervasive and profound metaphor is, because we have a tendency to think of it, again, as largely ornamental. Our culture is so beset comprehensively by patterns of trivialization. Again and again and again, you hear me say, we have trivialized this, we have trivialized that. Okay, we've talked about this, but I want to bring it back and develop it a little bit. How much of our thinking, and this goes to the work of Lakoff and Johnson, but I'll criticize it in a minute, and also somebody who I'm going to talk about later, Barfield, right? That we don't realize how much of our cognition, our ways of thinking and interacting with the world are being structured by metaphor. So, right, to use an example, I'm halfway through this lecture as if I was moving through a space. But I hope you get my point, or at least see what I'm saying. But you might not be able to, because some of the stuff I'm saying is really hard. It's really hard. It's really hard to get my point. But I hope you understand me. It used to be unterstand, by the way, stand within, but we changed it to understand, stand under. It's interesting, right? Even words that you don't realize are metaphorical, have a metaphorical origin, like interest, remember this? Inter esse, to be within something. So we're often, see, we're much more naturally poetic than we realize. We are constantly trying to do this, use one thing, look through one thing at another. Now, I have some criticisms of Lakoff and Johnson because they argue that what it is I have some embodied practice, and then that just gets projected up into abstract thought. And so one of their prototypical examples is, well, I'll say things like, he attacked my argument, right? And that's supposed to be from the hallmark of, abstract thought. That's from argumentation, where we're at our most rational. But we're actually using this word attacked, right? Which goes back to, physical assault. And the idea is we take what we have here and we project it onto here. I think this notion of projection is too simplistic. Okay? But this is the basic idea. I know what this is because it's embodied physical interaction, it's participatory, right? I know what it is to attack somebody, and then I use that, right? I sort of just project that onto the abstract conceptual domain, and that's how I get he attacked my argument. This reminds me of a point in Barfield. Barfield says, you read in the old text, and they'll use words like pneuma, sorry, right, which stands either for wind or spirit, and we can only hear it one way or the other, and that's why we break it into two words. I sort of get what Barfield's saying here, but the point is we use this word, right, and we move between these without realizing it. Like, we attacked the castle, he attacked my argument, and those aren't the same, but we may actually not notice that we're using them differently. Now, why do I say that? Well, this is work that I published, a couple articles with John Kennedy, where we said this simple model of just projecting doesn't seem quite right, because this, for example, carries with it, I can say I attacked the castle or I assaulted the castle, right? But if I say I assaulted his argument, it's like, what? What does that mean? That's weird. The near synonym doesn't transfer. And notice the reverse, abstract thought. Instead of saying I attacked his argument, I can say I criticized his argument. But if I say, let's criticize the castle, you don't, what? That sounds like a weird Monty Python routine. See, what I'm trying to show you is there isn't a simple sort of identity relation. We didn't just project this. And it's not that, right, we're just sort of trapped between two meanings. We seem to clearly have a sense of this that points downward towards the physical assault and then points upwards, if you'll allow me these metaphors, towards the conceptual. Notice also something else. Notice the three things I used earlier. Did you see my point? Do you grasp what I'm saying? Do you understand it? Right? Do you get it? These are very different interactions. These are very different things. There's seeing, there's understanding, there's getting, and there's grasping. And yet, all of those independently converge towards making something intelligible, right? The act of making something intelligible. What selected these four very different things and drew them up to their common converged meaning? See, what I'm trying to show you is it's not simply that this gets projected up. There's also something up here that's constraining and acting downward, helping us select which of all of our embodied existence we are going to use for our more abstract, conceptual topics. All right, so why is that important? Because I think that points towards a different way of understanding what the metaphor is doing. So there, of course, is an element of projecting, if projecting means to throw, but I think there's something much more complicated and interesting going on in a metaphor that isn't simply projection, which is, of course, itself a metaphor. Okay, so I think that symbols are going to tap into these deeper kinds of metaphors, not just the metaphors that are the ornamentations of language. These are the metaphors, these more profound metaphors that are structuring our cognition. And I'm trying to point out to you that they have not only a bottom-up emergence, they have a top-down emanation going on in them. There's a sense in which both sides are interacting in a powerful way. We need a much more dynamic account of what's at work in metaphor. So let's build towards that dynamic account. And we've already gained something, that symbols are going to be making use of these profound metaphors. The metaphors that are not just metaphors of speech, but are structuring the way we are making sense, making meaning of the world. Now, one important point of these kinds of metaphors that triggers on the participation, gets into the profundity, but doing something with it, is one of the jobs of these metaphors, right, is to hold in mind. Okay. So let me give you, right, an example of this. We care about justice. We really do. It's important to us. Our culture, in fact, is really wrestling with what does justice mean and how do we best serve it? How do we best realize it? But that means you need to be able to reflect on justice. You need to be able to contemplate it, to think about it. If you're going to think about it and not just emote or assert about it, if you're going to think about it, you need to hold it in mind. But how do you hold it in mind? If I were to ask you, without repeating the word justice, hold justice in mind. Do it. Hold, like, what are you doing? Like, right? You might be holding sort of a prototypical instance, but when I do this, and I do this repeatedly with my class, what people tell me is, well, when they want to sort of contemplate justice so they can reflect on it and get clearer about what it means to them, they often invoke a symbol. They invoke the symbol of the woman, blindfolded, holding a sword, carrying, right, holding the scales. So one of the things you're noting is that this, of course, is a profound metaphor. We use the notions of balance all throughout our talk about justice. We also use the sword as deciding, cutting, right? But let's stick with the balance. This allows us to hold justice in mind. That's it, like, stop, pause. If that's all the symbol was doing, that in and of itself is such a valuable thing we need to pause and appreciate. If I can't relate to justice in a participatory fashion where I can engage in it and I'm trying to internalize it and I'm trying to get clearer about it, I can't do any of that unless I can activate it and hold it in mind. And I need a symbol to do that. Now, the symbol is metaphorical. Justice isn't literally a scale, a balance. What's going on here? And what's right? And how does it plug into where I'm trying to argue there's something more than just projection going on? And this gets me to a notion that I've mentioned to you before. Exaptation. This really important work. You got to read his book by Michael Anderson on this. This is the idea that your brain, right, is a self-exaptation machine. Not only across species evolutionary, but more recently in his work within a brain in its own development. So to remember the example, my tongue has been exapted for speech. It has a structural functional organization for doing a particular set of tasks, but of course it has, remember the robot and the battery, it has all kinds of side effects, and those side effects are an ongoing reservoir of sets of capacities that I can tap into and make a new structural functional organization to do a new thing, which is what I'm doing right now. I'm speaking. So the tongue has been exapted for speech. And what he's arguing is that a lot of what we see in our cognition is what he calls circuit reuse. Circuits that have been used for one thing get reused, get exapted in the way I've just described by reconfiguring their structural functional organization, right, so that side effects become central effects, right? And what you do is you get a new machine, a new capacity created that way. So let's try and think about this, right? We've got a clear example in the cerebellum, right? The cerebellum originally evolved for helping you to keep your physical balance, right? And what it does is it takes information from many different sense modalities and is constantly looking for how to find patterns of contingency, patterns of relationship between what's happening in my vision, what's happening in my body. And it's really helping to do all this sophisticated coordination and smoothing out so that they start to coordinate together much better. That's your cerebellum. It's centrally involved in your balance. But you know what you've done? The cerebellum has been exapted. It's used not only for finding balance, between like my seeing and my moving. It's been exapted to find, right, deeper coordination between any different areas of domain in your brain. The cerebellum also allows you to integrate your vision with your working memory so that you can do visual imagery. Now, let's put this together carefully. You've got this, right, machinery of exaptation. You've got balance. And now what you're doing when you call up the balance idea is you're actually, right, notice your cerebellum has been exapted up to helping to you manage massively complex contingencies between variables. You know what you have to do to be a just person? You have to know how to balance. You have to optimize the relationship between, you have to pick up on and coordinate and smooth out the complex interaction between multiple variables. That's justice. You know what you can do if you invoke balance and don't just talk about it, but try and participate in it? You can actually do the reverse of this. You can go back through balance, right, and trigger, activate. You can go from justice through balance back to activating the machinery of the cerebellum. Like normally I am looking through all of that machinery at something. But what I can do with the symbol is, no, I don't want to, I want to actually sort of retrace, reactivate, go back through exaptation and activate the machinery of balance so that I can then use that machinery in order to get an optimal grip on this other domain, which is justice. See, this isn't just simple projection, right? There is not only a projecting up, there is an emanating back down. You're also reversing and going down and trying to reactivate this machinery in an important way. There's a top-down guidance that is intersecting with the bottom-up projection. And so the symbol is in that sense deeply participatory. You are trying to participate in this activation of the very cognitive machinery that is used both in participating in balance. You don't just look at balance, you have to be balanced, perspectively participatory, and then taking that machinery into being just, having your perspectival and participatory machinery aligned in a certain way. That's what the symbol is doing for you. It is deeply participatory. It allows you to hold in mind and then look back through to activate and then bring that back up to have insight, participatory and perspectival insight into something like justice. We're going to talk more next time about the symbol and how it relates to our experience of sacredness. Thank you very much for your time and attention.